Good afternoon. Welcome to CITRIS and our CITRIS Research Exchange seminar series. My name is David Lindeman. I direct the health programs here at CITRIS and am very pleased and honored today to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Rachel Kuperman. Before we do so, though, I'd like to share a few updates around our CITRIS programs and the current series, and give you some opportunities to participate in other CITRIS events going forward. So this is our 12th year of the CITRIS Research Exchange series. We've had a remarkable lineup of individuals already speaking here, and unfortunately we are not in Sudarjadai Hall, as you know, but the virtual program has worked out quite nicely. We also have a number of other programs in operation, particularly our telehealth webinar series. Our next program will be addressing family caregiving in telehealth in the era of COVID-19. And that will be next Tuesday morning at 9 a.m. Pacific time. And we will have speakers from the National Alliance for Caregiving, the Family Caregiver Alliance, National Alzheimer's Association, some of the largest programs in the world focusing on these issues and the impact of family caregiving in that area. You can see how you can register for that program, and please do share information about it with your colleagues. Our next CITRIS Research Exchange next week will be Wednesday, October 21st, same time, same place, and we will be having Gabe Utze, who is Chief Innovation Officer for our University of California Agriculture and Natural Resources program. So please look for more information regarding his program and the topic that he will be elaborating on. Again, you can see how you can register at the bottom of our screen. We'd also like to announce that our WITI program, our Women in Technology program, is having its UC Athena Awards, which recognize those women who embody, encourage, and promote the inclusion of women in technology and different organizations in that area. The awardees are leaders who inspire others to pursue and persist in technical careers by way of their outstanding contributions in this space. Nominations are now open, so we are looking for individuals and organizations to be submitted, and the information will be collected, and we have a closing date of November 6th. Again, you can find more information at the link on the slide. So moving to today's session, we would like to share that we will be using the Q&A function on your Zoom, on the Zoom program. You should see that icon in the bottom of the screen, and we would appreciate your putting any items into that as we move along. If you click the thumbs up on a question, it'll help bring that question to the top, and we'll bring that to Dr. Kuperman's attention, and we will be facilitating those questions at the end of her presentation today. So we will be not interrupting that program. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Rachel Kuperman. She'll be discussing, as you've seen, her company, Eysz, which is, and the topic will be on medical management and epilepsy, journey into the unknown. Dr. Kuperman is a MD, and she's the CEO and co-founder of Eysz, an early stage startup developing a real-time machine learning-based remote monitoring solution to reliably detect seizures associated with loss of consciousness. We are very pleased that she has been working within the CITRIS Foundry system on this, and she created the company to address the significant unmet need for identifying seizures outside of the hospital. So the company spun out of her research showing that eye movement and analysis can be used to detect seizures. She's done a great deal of that work at UCSF Benioff Children's Hospital here in Oakland, where I was pleased to first meet her. And she has also had a great deal of recognition for the company at this point by not only the Epilepsy Foundation, IEEE, and NIH, but most recently by the International Society for Optics and Photonics. And prior to her work co-founding Eysz, Rachel ran the Pediatric Epilepsy program at Children's Hospital, and for over 10 years. Her background is she did her degrees at UCSF Medical School and completed her Child Neurology Fellowship at Columbia, and then completed a specific Epilepsy Fellowship here at UCSF. So without further ado, we'd like to turn the program over to Dr. Kuperman, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. Let me share my screen the proper way. Let's see, share computer sound. There we go. All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. As you know, I am a pediatric epileptologist, a subspecialty within neurology. And epilepsy is a disease that we've known about for thousands of years, still very highly stigmatized throughout the world, and not very well understood. One of the things that always struck me was when I would see patients for the first time, they would say, well, nobody in our family has epilepsy. I don't know where this came from, the family would say. And then at the next visit, be like, well, actually, it turns out that so-and-so had seizures and so-and-so had seizures, but they just never talked about it. So, you know, from our standpoint, epilepsy is quite common. The number cited by the Epilepsy Foundation is roughly 1 in 26 people in the world have epilepsy. And epilepsy is really a condition when you have recurring seizures. It can affect all ages and ethnicities. One of the most frustrating aspects is that 50% of people, you have no known cause or etiology. That's being eaten away by genetics, but not as fast as we would have hoped. And, you know, I always used to tell my patients that if you fall into 50% where you don't know the etiology, usually that's good, oddly enough. So what is a seizure? Well, a seizure is abnormal, excessive, or synchronous neuronal activity. And seizures divided into two different types. There's primarily generalized seizures, which have a central focus and spread throughout the cortex almost immediately. And then there's partial seizures, which start in the cortex in one particular focus, and then spread from there. And depending on where the seizure is located and the parts of the brain affected, you get different symptomatology. So the way we think about seizures is that seizures are too much activity, meaning that that part of the brain is activated, as opposed to a stroke, which would be no activity in that part of the brain. So seizures are divided into three basic areas. You have focal seizures, like I mentioned, generalized onset seizures, and unknown. We just don't know if they're either. And we'll go into more detail as we move forward. So like I said, depending on what part of the brain is involved, you get different symptoms. So for example, if the occipital lobe is involved, people with seizures that start in this region can report loss of vision or funny visual scotomatas during the seizure. If they start in the temporal lobe, there can be problems with speech. And then as seizures spread from one region to another, it could start, for example, with problems with vision, then spread to problems with speech, and then spread to loss of consciousness in a partial seizure, for example. Many of you know the homunculus, and that has specific implications in epilepsy, where seizures can start, for example, in the tongue area with motor movements, and then spread in what's called the Jacksonian march as they affect other areas of the brain. Similar with sensory, and then, you know, obviously there's these two regions of the cortex sit next to each other, so you can imagine a sensory seizure very rapidly becoming a motor seizure. So depending on where a seizure starts and what people clinically report can give a lot of information about how, you know, what the underlying etiology is, or where you need to look on the imaging to figure out if there's a clear underlying etiology. And like I mentioned, depending on where they start, you would get different symptomatology. Interestingly enough, one of the most challenging aspects of epilepsy is that most seizures are associated with a loss of consciousness. And when someone loses consciousness, you can injure yourself, you're not protecting yourself, and it can be quite stigmatizing for people. We think of consciousness as two different systems. One is how awake, alert, and attentive you are. So that's considered the level of consciousness. And that's what's impaired in epilepsy, but you can also get impairment in the content of consciousness, meaning that you are having a sensory seizure and you don't have sensation, so you can't access those conscious feelings, but your level of consciousness is otherwise intact. And different parts of the brain, just like there's a motor and a sensory homunculus, control the consciousness homunculus, so to speak. And it's an important network that involves the brainstem as well as the cortex. So when someone has epilepsy, they have too much excitation in the brain, meaning that their networks are prone to get overexcited and cause seizures. And a normal brain should be well balanced, and this level of excitation and inhibition changes over a lifetime, so that in, for example, very young children, their brains are more excitable because they have a lot to learn. And as we get older, it becomes harder to learn things and we become a little bit more balanced, so to speak. And the goal of epilepsy treatment is to push down this level of excitation to get it to look more like a normal brain. So when we think of someone, we obviously can't measure excitation and inhibition. There's no current method that we have in clinical practice to understand it. What the clinician sees is just a seizure. So, or the family sees just a seizure. But there's all these other factors in the external environment that affect what we consider the seizure threshold. So for example, alcohol, having your period if you're a woman, missing medications and stress can all lead to a lower seizure threshold resulting in a seizure. Now, if somebody doesn't have epilepsy, you can have your period and drink alcohol without having any problems. And the challenge with epilepsy, obviously, is that this can fluctuate over time. Whereas before you were diagnosed with epilepsy, you had a normal seizure threshold, but then after the diagnosis, the seizure threshold may be lower, such that, for example, stress causes seizures, or there's no clear discernible factor that causes seizures. And over the course of someone's epilepsy, with or without treatment, this can fluctuate. Similarly, the goal of drugs is to push up the seizure threshold so that someone can have stress, they can be sick, they can not get enough sleep and not seize. And that's the basic concept for treatment in epilepsy. That being said, the treatment does not change the underlying etiology of the disease. So epilepsy is a heterogeneous disorder, meaning that it's caused by many different things. And the different etiologies of epilepsy result in different natural histories. And we have some information that can guide us as to what a person's natural history is likely to be. But we have no personalized natural history. This isn't like cancer where you can look up someone's genetic makeup of their cancer and know that that means that they're going to respond well to this and the prognosis is that. For most epilepsies, besides the single gene disorders, that data just isn't available. So the natural history, if we just left everybody untreated, 20 to 30% of people would go into remission. Meaning, and so the way to think about the medicines is that the medications don't alter the likelihood of remission, they just put you in remission sooner. And then roughly 30 to 40% of people, no matter what you do with medications, aren't going to remit. They're going to continue to seize. And these people are have the hardest to treat type of epilepsy. It's also known as intractable epilepsy. The typical causes are structural brain abnormalities. So a brain injury such as cerebral palsy, a birth injury, a stroke later in life. And we know that people who have abnormal MRI scans or high seizure frequencies at the time of diagnosis are the hardest to treat in general. So the literature tells us some natural history data. So this was a kind of a groundbreaking study done in 2012. They took people with new diagnosis of focal seizures and looked at what happens if you give them the first drug. So the first anticonvulsant was given to this fairly homogeneous population. And with the first anticonvulsant, roughly 50% of them stopped seizing. So first try, 50% no seizures, but 50% of them continued to seize. If they continue to seize because they had a side effect from the medications, they were much more likely to remit with the next drug. But if they continued to seize because the medicine didn't work, their likelihood of falling into that 1/3 population who didn't respond went up and up and up. So the main point is you can actually know somebody's natural history fairly early on based on how they respond to the medicine. And what this tells us is not that the medicine is a great medicine or a bad medicine. What it says is that the medicine is giving you insight into the disease, how they respond. So if they're not responding to the medicine, you have a harder epilepsy to treat. So in terms of the global impact of epilepsy, there are 70 million people with epilepsy worldwide, 3.4 million people in the United States. 80% of those live in low and middle income countries, and 75% of the people who live in low and middle income countries do not receive any treatment. And this is considered the treatment gap. The causes of the treatment gap are really a lack of trained staff, a poor access to resources and anticonvulsants, societal misconceptions and stigma around the disease, and low prioritization of treatment. And I can tell you, being on the other side of the fence now, trying to raise money for a company with epilepsy, I've spoken to global companies that help with undertreated diseases, but they don't see epilepsy as a target. And the reason is that not enough people die. They're more interested in targeting diseases where you have easy metrics for outcomes as opposed to epilepsy. So this continues to be an ongoing problem for people in this world. So in the US, there's 150,000 people diagnosed annually with epilepsy. If you are diagnosed with epilepsy, you have an increased risk of premature death. The total prevalence of the disease is roughly 3.4 million people. And remember, 1/3 of these don't remit to treatment, medical treatment. So about 1.1 to 1.2 million people have ongoing seizures despite maximal medical therapy. Annual expenditures on epilepsy, you'll see this number change depending on the source, but roughly between $15 to $30 billion. And many, many billions of dollars spent annually on EEG. So this child has a type of epilepsy. 1,
2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
You do it the way I show you, like this, Miguel. And where's the plus one?
And this is his seizure.
Miguel.
So he's having a behavioral arrest, a change in facial expression.
Miguel.
What's
the plus sign? You need to put the plus sign there.
He's actually going to have a second event.
Even though you're absent, she sent me the homework that when I was absent.
But do you know what they did, Miguel? Miguelito.
And it's over. So very brief event. You can imagine that as a parent or as a loved one who has a child that you have to report outcomes, that would be really hard to count. And this is, this is a general number for people who self-report or families report. We know that at minimum 50% of seizures are missed. This child doesn't know he seized. He can't tell us he seized. And unless the family member's looking at him, they wouldn't know. If you can imagine in a teacher in a room full of 25 kids or 32 kids, wouldn't pick up that this child isn't responsive for a brief period. So one of the challenges is that the outcome of epilepsy treatment is seizure count, but we know that we can't count seizures. So people think epilepsy is convulsive because this is what kind of the general population is taught is a seizure. But the bulk of epilepsy actually is minimally convulsive or non-convulsive and very hard to count. So our goal really, and my goal with starting this company was to do better, to be able to help manage people with epilepsy with the data that we need to know if their treatment is working. So what's the underlying kind of science behind it? So the basic concept is that eye movements take up a large amount of our brain real estate. And the reason is that our eye movements are used to focus on things that we're thinking about in our environment. And so when you alter eye movements, when you have a seizure, you alter the brain activity, and that results in a change in eye movements. And so if you look at kind of wild type eye movements, our eyes take data that from our occipital lobe representing the space, and we use that to plan our next move. And then we send the information to the right cranial nerves to make our eyes gaze at what we're interested in. Then we interpret the scene, etc. When you have a seizure or a loss of consciousness, this information is, basically we stop that from happening. And the eye movements are abnormal. So we know in other loss of consciousness disorders that there is a change in eye movements. So this is data from a study published in 1996 looking at the eye movements in syncope, which is fainting. And if anyone's seen anyone faint, you know that they have this very strange glazed over appearance to their eyes. And basically what happens is that the electrooculography data, so the measurement of the eye's dipole, shows this funny event where they have this downbeat nystagmus, their eyes point down, then they lose consciousness before they regain consciousness. So it's not just in epilepsy that we know that abnormalities in consciousness lead to eye movement changes. So our clinical study that we did when I was at UCSF basically started from me listening to families report what their children looked like when they had seizures. So family after family would tell me that when my loved one has a seizure, I know they're seizing because they have this strange glazed over appearance to their face and their eyes. And so we set out to measure that strange glazed over appearance. And this is an example of the kind of eye movement data that we generated. What you can see here is a child wearing a pair of glasses that have cameras pointed directly at the eyes. There is a software that's currently identifying her pupil size. And what we're basically doing is measuring this combined variable of eye movement over time and comparing that to EEG to identify when she's having a seizure, EEG being the theoretical gold standard. So we'll go into more of the data, but basically what you can see is that when she has the seizure, her eyes stop moving. That's the basic concept. Now it's going to jump ahead. So she's having a seizure right now, and then back to normal noise. So we'll go into more detail, but that's basically the foundation of the company, which is that we are really setting out to change the way we measure seizures and outcomes, not just for epilepsy, but for other neurological diseases. So we are building a digital health platform that measures not just disease progression, but intervention efficacy and side effects to assist clinicians in building a personalized care plan for people with epilepsy. So like I mentioned, the goal of epilepsy treatment is to stop or reduce seizures with minimal side effects. At this point, that is the reason we make drug selections, dosing selections, and it's the same reason that pharmaceutical companies pick certain medication, it's the same goal that pharmaceutical companies have when they're developing drugs or other interventions. I always go back to my days at Children's Hospital when our offices were next to the endocrinologist offices, and their patients, they would have diabetes clinic, their patients would come in and they would download all this glucometer data for the child's glucose over time to see how the insulin was affecting them. And we had nothing. We would go into the room and ask families like, how's it going? How many seizures since the last visit? Is your child drowsy? And it's just like the dark ages of medicine. So we know that as doctors, when we're making medication changes, patients are at high risk, meaning that because we're prescribing by trial and error, patients may be underdosed or overdosed. They're at increased risk for seizures. And it's really expensive because if you're 4 times more likely to have a seizure, you're much more likely to end up in the emergency room or at another doctor's visit or to fall and injure yourself, which leads to significantly increased healthcare utilization. The current methods that we have for measuring outcomes from epilepsy treatment are just not sufficient. Like I mentioned, the American Academy of Neurology recommends hovering or close observation to know if your loved one's having a seizure. They did a study at one point on mothers of children with epilepsy, and I can tell you they were not getting any sleep. And if you don't get sleep, it's very hard to deal with the ups and downs of daily life, particularly with a loved one that may have periods of significant stress for the family. There are 2 FDA-approved digital wearables that measure convulsive seizures. The challenge, of course, is that less than 20% of seizures, total seizures, are convulsive. So that leaves 80% of people without an option. EEG has been around for 90 years. The problem with EEG is that although it's good for diagnosis, it's not good for management. And as a result, costs related to epilepsy have increased quite significantly over the last 30 years, but outcomes have not improved. And when you're a resident learning about epilepsy and neurology, you're always taught to treat the patient or treat the seizures, don't treat the EEG, because you'll see patients with very abnormal EEGs who are doing quite well, and you'll see patients with very normal EEGs who are doing quite poorly. So it's a problem with the traditional biomarker that we've used in the disease. And even the FDA says that it's not the EEG that's the gold standard, it's the read of 3 neurologists of the EEG. So that's an important distinction. So our goal really is to develop a personalized care plan for people with epilepsy. So to take a consumer grade eye tracker, the data output from that is then used in our software to produce a physician report that can be used to help guide treatment. In terms of the benefit, our goal is to improve epilepsy care. If patients are doing better, then they're not going to use the hospital as much. They're not going to end up admitted or in the emergency room. It will be cheaper, right? If you're a pharmaceutical company and you are developing a new drug and you're relying on self-reported seizure counts, which are 50% inaccurate as the FDA requirement for showing that your drug works, that's going to be a pretty expensive process, right? So you can imagine if you're looking at types of epilepsies, you might look at a type of epilepsy that produces big convulsive seizures because those are easier to count than small subtle seizures, right? Leaving many people without new therapy options. Also, the costs of running new trials has become astronomical over the last 20 years. And if you have a tool that would allow you to run cheaper, smaller trials, that could be very beneficial. Similarly, people want better quality of life. If you can imagine you have a teenager with epilepsy with a parent always 3 steps behind, worried about them, that is a pretty poor quality of life, right? Where they're supposed to be doing all these other activities at that age. And if you can provide confidence to the family that you're actually measuring what's going on and making appropriate medication changes, that would be very valuable. And then finally, integrating with the existing workflow. The only way to help patients through doctors is to make it easier for the doctor, not to make it harder, and that's really our goal. So we completed the proof of concept at UCSF when I was in Oakland. Basically, we took 30 children with absence epilepsy. They had EEGs at the same time that they were wearing an eye tracker. They had this is data from the eye tracker, the left eye and the right eye, and the EEG seizure is this red line and these are the type of seizures that I showed you that little boy has. It lasted about 10 seconds. And what you can see is that there's noisy eye movements. The child had a seizure, the eyes stopped moving. It was that funny glazed over appearance he had, followed by return to the normal noisy eye movements. This was the basis for the patent that we filed. We filed additional patents since then as a machine learning company, so to speak. We understand that one of our most valuable assets is our data sets, which we are protecting as if they were trade secrets. So our goal, like I mentioned, is to get to people with epilepsy through their physicians. And to do that, we need an FDA-approved device. We've completed a proof of concept. We've done extensive market validation. We've met with the FDA and outlined a clear path, including a 510(k) pathway. Our goal is to be device agnostic, meaning that any eye tracker, consumer-grade eye tracker that meets our minimum specifications can be the input for our device. Our clinical study has started at UCSD and CHOC, where it's about to start up at UCSF. The plan is actually to apply for breakthrough status with the FDA and submit to the FDA roughly in about a year. In terms of the market, there are roughly 70 million people with epilepsy globally, 3.5 million in the United States. And routine EEG roughly costs about $500 per patient. If you imagine that everybody gets on average 2 routine EEGs per year, that makes the market size roughly 3.4 billion. We're focused, like I said, on the 80% who have loss of consciousness events with their seizures. And then our initial beachhead market is in absence epilepsy, which is roughly 10% of the market. In terms of our business model, you know, in order to get doctors to adopt something, you have to work within the existing system. In the fee-for-service model, you need to have billing codes that physicians can bill for interpretation of the information produced by your device. So there actually are existing CPT codes. We plan on applying for additional ones as well as what's called the Durable Medical Equipment Code, or HCPCS code. As value-based care is emerging, you know, the goal really is to show that a device like ours can improve outcomes and decrease hospitalization. So to position ourselves as not just a tool that physicians can use to bill, but as a tool that can improve outcomes and quality of life. Pharmaceutical companies are similarly interested in being able to measure the outcomes of their clinical studies reliably and consistently, and have actually reached out to us to assist with clinical studies, and that is a fixed fee model. So in terms of our go-to-market strategy, our 2 markets, like I mentioned, are pharmaceutical companies and epilepsy centers initially. In order to get to epilepsy centers, we are, I would say, a small development firm at the moment. We'll partner with larger, with EEG manufacturers and service providers to provide our hardware and software solution. For pharmaceutical companies, it would be more of a direct sale and support. The goal really is to influence the market by publications of our clinical research, by continuing education, conferences, and we already have developed relationships and received funding from the Epilepsy Foundation, as well as the other advocacy groups in the epilepsy space. So in terms of our growth strategy, we're focused on epilepsy initially, but what we're doing basically is providing measurements for the neurological exam. And the neurological exam is not disease specific. So the goal is to take the learnings we have in this initial beachhead market in epilepsy and provide it to other neurological diseases, because they need to know just as much, you know, are there events happening? How is this person doing over time? Are they drowsy from the medication I've put them on? And that information currently is just lacking. So our goal is really to develop a data set that will allow us to move from detection and measurement all the way to diagnosis and prediction. And to grow the company by looking at new territories as well as new markets. In terms of recognition, we have received funding from the NIH, from the Epilepsy Foundation, from Greenwich Biosciences, from the Consortium for Technological Innovation in Pediatrics, which is a FDA-funded accelerator, and from the National Science Foundation. And, you know, whenever you're a small, early stage company, you have to have a plan to how to grow. And our plan is really to grow the value of our company and market and partner with potential acquirers as we develop. So I'm the CEO of Eysz. I have 2 co-founders. Jit is at UCSB. His background is in scientific computing and machine learning. Parth is also a co-founder, and his background is in actually radiation oncology, business development, and alliances. Our advisory panel is based, our scientific advisors are Bob Fisher and Hal Blumenfeld, both kind of luminaries in the epilepsy and neurology fields. Peter Milford's background is in eye tracking. He sold a company called iFluence to Google. Steve Detty's helping us with some of our business development, and Nicole's a neuropsychologist who's helping us develop those algorithms. Randy Berholtz is a father of a child who has epilepsy, and his background's in finance and law, and he is our independent board of directors. And Eric is from UCB Pharma, who's currently our largest investor. So we're currently fundraising our seed round. So if you know anyone who's interested in investing in our company, you should reach out to me. We have raised $1.4 million to date, and this is enough to get us through our clinical development study. The additional money will be used for submission to the FDA. And that's it. Thank you so much.
Well, and thank you, Rachel. Wonderful presentation. Before we turn to some of the questions, one point that was raised by some of our listeners when you did run the video of the young man, we lost some of your audio over it. So I think some of us heard a little bit, but if you could just repeat what you were describing, I think that would be helpful. And then we will turn to several of the questions that have been raised.
All right, let me try again. I can share and see if we can. So basically what I was pointing out was that the child had a seizure, and his seizure consisted of this kind of strange appearance to his face. So let me share. This is a video his father gave me permission. It's on YouTube also.
Plus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
Do it the way it showed you, like this, Miguel. And where's the plus sign?
So this is his seizure
Miguel,
right now.
Miguel.
Not responding to his father,
Miguel.
saying his name
Huh?
over and over again.
Where's the plus
Over,
sign?
very
You need to
brief.
put the plus sign there.
Even though you're absent, she sent me the homework that when I was
Yeah, but
absent.
This
do you
is
know
the
what
seizure
begin
again
here,
now.
Miguel? Miguelito.
Thank you very much. I
All
think
right,
it
I
would
hope that
help.
helps.
It did, but you may want to describe it one more time because the sound overlapped each other.
Oh,
So.
okay, so basically he's doing his normal, he's doing his homework, and then suddenly he stops and he's kind of got this funny appearance, and he sits there and he blinks a little bit, and then he returns to just normal activity. So that's basically what an absence seizure looks like.
Well, thank you very much. Well, first, let me just say this is spectacular. Thank you for taking us through it. This is one of the wonderful examples of showing us not only the issues behind the clinical applications and how you've looked at the research, but also to bring this to market. And it's a perfect model for many of our startups that have come through the Foundry, our colleagues throughout the CITRIS innovation ecosystem. So really appreciate your walking people through that. And we may have some questions from our other colleagues who are facing some similar issues, not just in digital health, but how you do start up a company as you're doing so thoughtfully and successfully. There were a few questions, even from the very beginning, I could raise from the Q&A, and that is, in your initial diagram showing the different areas of the brain in which a seizure can originate, the question in particular was, do they all trigger an eye signal? Or are there different ways you can estimate percentages of seizures in these areas? What are some of the differentiating qualities?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So that's one of the things that we are in process of answering. So we feel like the signal we're picking up currently is actually from loss of consciousness, that it's the interruption of consciousness and your conscious control of eye movements that is our signal right now. And absence epilepsy is a great model for that because it's almost a pure loss of consciousness without other features, no significant motor features. Other epilepsy types start in one part of the brain, and then as the seizure spreads to include both hemispheres, there's a loss of consciousness, right? So our initial step really is to do this first study in absence epilepsy, get a very clear picture of what loss of consciousness looks like, and then go look at all those other seizure types and understand when are we starting to pick up the eye movement changes? Are we picking up the eye movement changes at the time of loss of consciousness or prior to the loss of consciousness? And can we then subcategorize those into, occipital lobe seizures look like this, frontal lobe seizures look like that. And that's an important question that we're going to have to answer as we move forward. So our initial study is on this subpopulation, but that data will then allow for that bigger study of all the epilepsy types to move much faster because we'll have a much better idea of what it is we're looking for specifically.
Well, thank you very much. There's a very interesting question that to push a little bit further, do you see other types of, besides eye movement, which is your specialty and what you've been focusing on, other types of potential measures or metrics that you could use? In particular, the question is, can you measure facial muscle activity or animation? Could those be substitutable for some of the work you're looking at or complementary?
Yeah, so you'll see work in the epilepsy space, for example. One of the big challenges is nocturnal seizure monitoring, right? Someone sleeping alone in a bed, if they had a convulsion, they could suffocate from having the pillow in their face, and that correlates with the increased risk of premature death in people with epilepsy. So in the nocturnal monitoring space, what you see is the development of algorithms that use vectors for body position to measure the convulsive seizures. So there's no reason to suspect that facial movements are somehow separate or unique from eye movements. And we plan on measuring facial movements as well. It just so happens that our initial devices are really focused on eye movements because that's the consumer technology that's available right now. Right? You can imagine you could have somebody wearing a hat and it's pointed at their face and you can get better measurements of the face. But otherwise, you would definitely need wires or something sensing face movement or video camera from further away.
Mm-hmm. Could you take it one step further then in terms of for treating some of the seizure issues? A key issue that a number of the listeners today are intrigued with. What type of medical devices, either invasive or non-invasive, do you envision, or could you share with us that are currently either in testing or have shown some positive benefit in terms of reducing seizures? Are there any? And we have a complementary question regarding other types of technology solutions. Have you, for example, particularly even in your area, focused specifically have you talked to AR and augmented reality and virtual reality companies in terms of how they are tracking these issues? So both the treatment as well as complementary assessment tools. Love to hear your thoughts.
I'll do the AR VR one first because that one's easier. So most AR VR headsets have eye trackers in them. There's different modalities of eye tracking, video-based or LiDAR or MEMS-based. And the concept behind the eye tracking is that it's very power intensive to run a full screen. And if you can just have a crisp area where someone's looking and the rest blurred out, you can save a lot of power. So for example, the Halo headset has a 60 hertz eye tracker built in. So most of those eye trackers run between 30 to 60 hertz. So our goal with this initial clinical study is to answer the question of what's the minimum specifications we need to run our algorithm with sufficient sensitivity and specificity so that ultimately we could run it on that type of device when it becomes available. When we answer the question, can we run it? So, and as part of the FDA process, they're asking us to do that as well. So to develop a validation so that you can take any new device as it comes out and is developed and use that device as the input for your algorithm. So that's the answer to question one. Question two, in terms of treatment. So there's a lot of work right now being done on treatment. Beyond medications, there's a lot of different treatment modalities, mostly focused on neuromodulation. So neuromodulation through the vagus nerve, for example, sending a signal back up to the thalamus, which is the timekeeper, so to speak, in the brain. There's also direct stimulation of the brain through a company like NeuroPace, or Medtronic now has a device that goes into the thalamus. So that's really focused on stopping the seizures and counting the seizures as they happen. The problem is that, which is really interesting, right? So it goes to show how limited EEG is. So NeuroPace, for example, could record on a single patient 800 seizures a day, walking around 800 seizures, but the patient only clinically may have 2 seizures a day, right? So what do you do with all that data, right? What do you do with those 798 events that weren't seizures? And it has to do with the way EEG turned into our biomarker. But is that a seizure? Is it a seizure if there's no clinical implication? You can't treat 800 events a day, right? You're going to fry somebody's brain with neurostimulation. So it's important to understand the limitations of how we're measuring things. There's also a company that's that's working, I think they're in their phase 2 studies, basically giving drug directly into the ventricular system, because one of the challenges with drug management is that the drug's not getting to where it needs to be in the brain. And so if you give it directly, will that lead to better outcomes? So I think there's a lot of work in the space trying to improve treatment outcomes through non-medication approaches.
Very nice. There is a similar question related to how you're doing some of these measurements. So I'll read this one directly so you could respond to it. Would a small implant not far from the eyes to record EOGs be justifiable on refractory patients?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So, there's actually companies who are working right now on implantable EEG. So like, for example, a small electrode under the skin going forward to measure seizure counts. So, I think the question is, it's really a risk-benefit analysis for that particular patient, right? So in a refractory population, how helpful is this data going to be in management and change outcomes? And I think that, it's a much stronger story, for example, if you can connect our algorithms to something like a vagal nerve stimulator and make a closed loop system, right, where we're providing input for seizures or a device that can then stimulate, than if it's just counting. So I think it's definitely something that that we're thinking about, but the risk-benefit analysis has to fall the right way. So from our concept initially, the challenge is really with the initial management. What are you going to do with this 5-year-old sitting in front of you whose parents you're asking to count these events? How are those parents going to tell you that this child is obviously better and that they're not falling asleep in school, that you're doing the right thing with the medication? And right now we just don't have the data. I'm not going to implant anything in that kid, right? But for somebody else who might be suffering from, they live alone, they need more information, they need an alert sent, it's a different calculation. So it's just very dependent on the scenario.
Thank you again. And again, just to share with you that many laudatory comments here. Appreciate this full presentation. The one question that really plays off of what you just answered is just the practical side of doing this, either for use by families, individuals going forward, much less as a research complement, et cetera. Would you envision patients buy glasses, or would they be loaned from physicians to the families in that area? And what do you envision as a price point in this area? Because that will, it's one thing for reimbursement and payment and value-based care, as you've described. It's another if we're going to low and middle income countries. We're also looking at individuals who aren't within our a fully covered health plan.
It's a great question. So, my goal, for the reason we are going through the FDA process and targeting clinicians, is that I believe the medical system should pay for a tool that helps physicians make decisions, and that it shouldn't be a family-related cost. The good news is that eye trackers are becoming ubiquitous and going down very significantly in cost. And one of our partners, for example, has an eye tracker commercially available. You can buy it, that does a very good job of doing eye tracking for $800. There will be patients who just need to use something like this intermittently, but you can imagine as we move from a measurement to a prediction, the desire to wear it for longer periods of time will become more prevalent. So from our standpoint, our goal really is to partner with existing technology developers to allow our software to live on their hardware as their hardware is continuing to mature and come down in cost. And what that boils down to is we believe that clinicians will have some devices similar to the way EEG is done currently, where you can send some patients home with an ambulatory EEG. They could send some patients home with a eyeglass. And then you would also be able to get it from a specific, if you're like me and you wear glasses, you need the right lens in there, right? So partnering with companies who make frames already is one of our goals, so to keep costs down.
That leads to a very interesting set of questions in terms of your channel partners and how you look at that. And you described a number of those. One of our questions was, would the VA be a good partner, or DoD? Would there be organizations that are clearly be able to take this to scale? And on the private side, are there other groups? You just mentioned, again, glasses, large companies like VSP and others that are really very much in this space, particularly with children, national and international bases. What do you envision? It sounds like you're looking at a number. Could you share some insights as to these different organizations?
Yeah, so from our standpoint, our goal is to develop the algorithms, the software, the power of what we're building, and to partner with other channel partners and people in the space who have the sales channels and the tools to really commercialize a product like this. I mean, we are a startup. We are a lean, mean, quick moving machine, but we are not a commercialization system at the moment. So, you know, from our standpoint, the goal really is to leverage existing partners, because we don't want to build the hardware. Why should a bunch of doctors and signal processing people be building hardware, right? When companies like Apple are building AR headsets, and, you know, Microsoft. And so to give you an example, the military spent, you know, some absurd amount of money to get AR headsets for their troops, right? So if you want to measure troop readiness, you could imagine just running our algorithm in the background of their AR headset to know, you know, how's somebody doing with their drowsiness? How is somebody doing in terms of consciousness? Did they have an event that would suggest that there was a loss of consciousness? How are they doing in terms of their processing speed and reading? So all that information can be garnered and assist in troop readiness, for example. So the DoD is a partner that we have talked to in the past. They're planning on talking to more in the future as we get further along. Similarly with the eyeglass manufacturers, there's a lot of players in that space right now, and the space is moving really quickly. And like I said, our goal is to develop the validation process so that we can partner with multiple partners to find the best solutions as time moves on. You know, maybe it's a contact lens, not glasses, right? Maybe for when we get the minimum specifications of our algorithm, I don't know about you, but I'm spending a lot of time with my webcam looking at my eyes, right? If it's a 60 hertz device with the minimum specification, maybe that can be doing it in the background, right? So, you know, our goal really is to kind of figure out the limits and push it.
Perfect. So we're getting close on time. I'd like to ask one more final question, if I could. And for our colleagues that are on and those who will watch us in the future, as I compliment you again on doing a wonderful startup, you have now full experience in moving from clinical and research world into the world of creating a startup. Do you have any guidance for our colleagues who are early stage or thinking about moving into digital health? Any of the key elements that you would suggest to them to help them in their journey, and or any of the barriers that you think are things that people should be considering as they take this on themselves?
That's a great question. So I would definitely say it's a journey. It's lonely. It doesn't have the same metrics as, you know, in medicine. I could see X number of patients per day, and I felt like I was making progress in certain areas. And it's not the same when you're running a startup. And you definitely have to be comfortable with the uncomfortable learning curve. I can tell you, you know, I still struggle with QuickBooks. So, you know, there's definitely a ton to learn. I would say that some of the biggest helps really was kind of getting rid of the concept that life is a meritocracy, and understanding that the network of people that you know is really very important, and expanding your network and talking to a lot of people is just super important. The second thing that really helped me was the National Science Foundation I-Corps program, which you guys have a node there. You know, I would say anybody who's interested in doing a startup needs to go through that program. We did the node at Berkeley, and then we did the national program, and I just can't tell you how valuable it was. First of all, to expand our network, but second, to make sure that we had a product, right? And that, you know, we were meeting a need beyond, you know, I knew as a doctor we were meeting a need, but that didn't mean that we had a business, and just answering the question of, do you have a business, is really important. So I would say take advantage of the ecosystem at Berkeley and the Bay Area. I mean, there's so much stuff, but really it's a little hard to say in the times of COVID, but you have to go out and talk to people and, you know, throughout kind of the space to build up the network that you need to move these things forward.
Well, those are wonderful words of wisdom. Thank you so much for sharing that. Thank you so much for sharing all the work you've done, and congratulations on an outstanding job to date. We're very excited to track and follow, and we're thrilled that the CITRIS system can be a modest part to support you. For those of you who would like to do follow up more with Dr. Kuperman, as you've seen in the chat, her LinkedIn is available, so feel free to reach out if you have specific questions. This program will be, it has been recorded, it will be put up on YouTube, and you can track all of our fall 2020 CITRIS Research Exchange presentations, and those from years before that are also available in this link. So with that, we look forward to you joining us next week for those who are available. We're on Wednesday the 21st at noon again. We'll be having Gabe Utze, Chief Innovation Officer for the UC Agricultural and Natural Resources Program, and we hope you can join us then. And once again, we'd like to thank Dr. Kuperman for a spectacular presentation and wish you all a wonderful afternoon.
Take care, everyone.